Hello and welcome to what I call a NOTCAST. Now, I'm doing an introduction today because normally I don't do introductions. Normally, I do episodes where I talk about things that interest me, but not a huge amount of other people, such as, for example, my favourite albums or movies or band t shirts or things like that. But today I'm going to talk about something else that's related to current events, and it may very well be seen by more people, it may be seen by less. So I'm going to do an introduction around what this is. My name is Mark, and I do a YouTube series called the NOTCAST, which is not a podcast, where I talk about whatever interests me. And I've done about 60 of these so far on the grounds that in the current lockdown, we aren't going anywhere, we haven't got a social life, and we're not actually doing a huge amount. What I'm going to talk about today, I have put a poll up on Twitter, and I have been told that I can talk about this as long as I promise not to be boring, which I think 94.1% of you said you were interested in hearing about this. So today I'm going to talk about what's happening in the news at the moment relating to Matt Hancock and procurement of personal protective equipment, PPE, which is in the news. Now, it's going to feel like the beginning of, if you've seen a James Bond film, imagine I'm stroking a white cat and I'm going to tell you my evil plan. There's going to be a lot of information I'm going to throw at you, but I'm going to put all the links in the comments or maybe in the description so that you've got a full guide to everything you can back up and you can actually do your own research. Now, I know do your own research is slang for I saw a guy on YouTube talking about it, but I promise you in this instance, what I'm going to be telling you is 100% verifiable, backed up and fully public information. So in the news at the moment, there is a lot of talk about Matt Hancock and the award to a firm which I believe is called Hinpack, which is run by the guy who's the landlord of his local pub that won a contract for, I think, £30 million for the provision of face masks and protective equipment during the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 and 21. So we have to take a step back. I just have to explain why that's something that you might be interested in. There's a court action at the moment that's ongoing through an organisation called the Good Law Project, which is crowdfunded. And this organisation, frankly, shouldn't be crowdfunded. Access to justice should be free, and we shouldn't rely on asking people to contribute to a crowd-funded legal action to find out how the government is spending our money. Now, to give you an idea of how much money the government has spent on PPE and face masks and protective equipment since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, which comes to £18.5 billion. Now, as a taxpayer, you might think, oh, that's an awful lot of money. It's still not as much as Elon Musk is probably worth, although his net worth has dropped dramatically recently. But 18.5 billion is for each one of the 30.3 million taxpayers in the UK is over £500 per person. Hang on, I'm going to do the sums and I'll come back and tell you exactly. Thanks. I'd like to thank my calculator for helping me out there. So, per taxpayer in the UK, you have currently spent £610 of your taxes on personal protective equipment, face masks, gowns, and similar equipment relating to COVID. So this is, for a lot of people, a lot of money. It certainly is a lot of money for me. And what matters and what's important is how the government have spent that money. Now, of that 18.5 billion, according to a National Audit Office report, 10.5 billion has been awarded in direct contract awards without competition. And for what this means in layman's terms is only one firm quoted for the work, nobody else quoted for the work, and 10.5 billion was awarded to firms where there weren't multiple quotes that were sourced. I have to get a bit legal on you. There are some legislation, there's some legislation and some regulation that defines and guides spend in the public sector. Now, spend in the public sector, the UK public sector, that is governments, councils, local authorities, NHS, military, spend around £290 billion of taxpayers' money per year on goods, products, services from third parties, of which, all of it over a certain value legally should be competed and multiple quotations sourced. There's a bit of legislation which I have read, so you don't have to, which is called the Public Contract Regulations 2015 and the Public Contract Regulations Amendments 2020 relating to Brexit, which doesn't apply to this particular issue which I'm talking about at the moment. But the principles behind that are that once the spend reaches a certain threshold, which under the PCR 2015 was about £189,000, the contract should be competed openly, transparently, fairly and ethically across the whole of Europe. And so therefore there's a process called OG, which stands for the Official Journal of the European Union. And effectively it's a great big yellow pages of contract opportunities across the whole of the EU. And if the spend is over £189,000 for goods and services and over about 4.5 million for property work, it should be advertised in there. Or you can use a thing called a framework, which is a pre-awarded set of contracts that have been competed through OGU, effectively a shortlist. Now, for the 18.5 billion of PPE and related spend which came through as a result of COVID-19, 10.5 billion of that spend they didn't get multiple quotations, bids or offers for, which is important. There is a section in the PCR 2015 regulation, section 32.2, I think C, which says that if it's due to factors outside of the control of the contracting authority, you may, in very limited and exceptional circumstances, award a direct contract award without the need for further competition. And there was a thing called the public procurement, well, there's a procurement policy notice, 0120, which was issued by the Cabinet Office. And 0120 effectively states, and here it is, by the way, on my screen, the procurement policy note responding to COVID-19 in March 2020 effectively says, in these very limited circumstances, you can award contracts to one firm without getting multiple quotations if the circumstances permit and allow you to do so. So, bearing in mind that that regulation tends to be used very, very rarely and by exception in emergency circumstances, and it shouldn't be down to the failure of, let's say, the Department of Health to be able to adequately respond to that. I'm throwing a whole bunch of information at you. I'm not going to apologise about that. This stuff is complicated and I'm trying to make it as simple and as straightforward as it can be. So of that 10.5 billion, we're going to pull out just a couple of contract awards. Now, out of that 10.5 billion, by the way, only 50 million was competitively tendered, openly, freely, with multiple bids received, which, by the way, is just over 1/4%. It's actually 1/360th of the total amount that was spent was competed openly and transparently to everybody, which is a shocking number. Now I'm going to pick out 3 or 4 big firms or big contract awards. Certainly big to me, not big necessarily to the Department for Health. There was 252 million that was awarded to a company called Ianda. There was 108 million awarded to a company called Clandeboine Agencies, which specialises in providing confectionery. 345 million was the value of the contract award to a company called PestFix, that specialised in pest control. And there was, I think, 200 million was awarded to a company called Sega. Now, the contract awards in Sega, we know actually the middleman that was arranging that contract was due to be paid $50 million. And the only reason we know that is because he's taken one of the other contracting parties to court in Miami, where all the court transcripts are published. So there's a middleman that's made 50 million, or was hoping to make 50 million, contractually, all fairly and squarely and above board, out of the COVID-19 pandemic by just inserting themselves into the supply chain and promising to parts of the UK that they could provide the necessary and safe PPE. And there are no guarantees, by the way, that PPE was delivered, but there's still 50 million that someone was paid just for being the middleman in that, which is pretty shocking when you think about that. Now, one of the other contract awards, and I'd rather not name them, they supplied 50 million FFP2 masks, which were not up to the NHS standards. So the NHS bought 50 million masks that were supplied with elastic ear strands as opposed to cotton ones, which didn't meet the standards and therefore couldn't be used. Now the risk is that in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic is that the public sector is going to spend money on things it doesn't need because it thinks it needs them and it's not quite sure whether it's going to need them. So the average stock holding in the UK for PPE in the NHS was something like 2 weeks worth of supply, and as a result of COVID-19, the UK ordered 5 years worth. Now, the lifespan of those face masks is not 5 years, which means we inevitably will have spent billions of pounds on face masks, which we didn't need, won't be able to use, and will have to throw away, even if they were compliant to the standards and expectations that we had for them. It's pretty shocking, really, and it's just an example, I think, of the lack of adequate care and diligence that took place during some of these contract awards. I'm going to move on to another couple of things, if that's okay. One of the things that defines activity in the public sector is something you probably haven't heard of. Here's another page from it. It's called Nolan's 7 Principles of Public Life. And Nolan's 7 Principles of Public Life should apply. They're the expected standards that are ethical and expected of all office holders who serve the public. So that would be everyone from the Prime Minister downwards to your council employees. And the 7 principles of Nolan's 7 principles are very, very straightforward. Effectively, they are, I'm just going to read them out off a page here rather than try to memorise them, are selflessness. So that is, holders of public office should act solely in the terms of the public interest. Integrity. So they've got to act fairly, ethically, honestly, and be telling you the real circumstances. And there's got to be objectivity in their decision making. They've got to be accountable for it. So they've got to be accountable for their decisions and actions, and not just through elections every 5 years. There's got to be openness, so the decisions have to be taken openly and transparently. They've got to be honest, and they've got to maintain and uphold the principles and standards of what's called leadership. So we've got to set an example. Now, that didn't happen, I think, in this case. So we have a case where Matt Hancock's local pub landlord texted Matt Hancock and said that he wanted to or could provide PPE, and a contract was awarded to his firm, which, as I understand it, was worth, let me just quickly look and see if I can find my crib notes on this, something like £30 million. And if you see Matt Hancock on Sunday, when Matt Hancock was interviewed, I think on the Andrew Marr show, he had a picture of the pub that pub landlord is the landlord of, on his wall. He has now moved his webcam and he has taken the picture down, presumably because he doesn't want to be known for that. But I'm afraid to say it's too late now. This is it's a shocking state of affairs, where a pub landlord can text his local MP and then say, well, I can provide you with some PPE. And then all of a sudden they get a contract for £30 million for a company that specialises in manufacturing takeaway boxes and plastic cups. And this firm is called Hinpack. And I don't want to say anything negative about Hinpack. None of what I'm saying is about the company. It's about the process, and it's about the award decisions that have been made, and about the lack of transparency, and about the lack of, I think, fair dealing. So there's some information here which you can find on Companies House about Hinpack, and you can look at their annual turnover, and the last declared annual turnover is the financial statements for the company, which again fully publicly available. That company had I think £145,000 worth of spend in the year, which ran July 2018 to July 2019. Now, if you're worth £145,000 and your company specialises in something that isn't the provision of, for example, face masks, protective equipment, healthcare equipment, I'm going to have to say it doesn't look like you're making the best decisions on the basis of being fully informed. In fact, it looks very much like your department may be scrabbling around for providers and awarding contracts to anybody that says that they can provide them. Now, there are a number of principles around public sector procurement that are very, very important around this. First and foremost, if you are the necessary Secretary of State or wherever it is, and a company that your area or division is contracting with, or you know the person that's running that company, you should make a declaration to the Declaration of Interest. There's an MP's register, I think, around separate business interests as well, and in any good private or public sector organisation there's also a process around declaring interests and conflict of interest. So people know, for example, that if you are Matt Hancock and your local pub landlord, let's call him John Smith, has texted you and said, I can provide PPE, as the secretary or let's say the Secretary of Health, you should be declaring under the MP's register and to the declaration of interests under the relevant department that yes, I know this guy that's just won this contract that's worth £30 million. And I don't think that's controversial to say. I think the next thing around that is that so let's say you're the Secretary of Health or the relevant Minister for Health, and you're going to award a contract for £30 million to a company that specialises in takeaway boxes and plastic cups that has a turnover of £145,000. You're then going to award a contract to that firm for the provision of face masks and protective equipment during the middle of a pandemic for £30 million. And I think it's fair that you declare that on the declaration of interests and go, I know this dude. Otherwise, it starts to look a little suspicious. And I think one of the rules that we have to have around contract awards in the public sector is that if it looks suspicious, if it smells suspicious, if it quacks like a duck, it probably is a duck. And what we do have to do is then investigate that and be sure about it. And there is no transparency around this process at all. Now, from the outside observer's point of view, what it looks like is that there was a contract award that was made to a company that texted the relevant, the most important person, whatever they are, Secretary of Health, and then said, I've got a firm that can do this. And then that firm gets a contract for £30 million that's not competitively tendered, that's not subject to multiple bids, that's not subject necessarily to the full requisite due diligence. It looks suspicious. And it looks like what a lot of people have called cronyism, which is very, very important. One of the normal kind of indicators of a country that is starting to become a failed democracy is cronyism, and that is jobs for the boys. So, for an example, there's a thing called the Grand Palace in Bucharest in Romania. It's one of the biggest buildings in the world. Over 70% of the rooms in that building have never been used. You know, it's absolutely enormous, and its heating bill comes to millions and millions of pounds. And what we saw there when that was constructed was a mass diversion of public funds to, I think it was the dictator's brother's construction company. And effectively, it's corrupt when you have a situation like that. It does not look in any way fair, ethical, or transparent. And Nolan's 7 principles, which I've mentioned earlier on, were the direct result of a cash for questions scandal which took place in the government in the early 90s, where I think the boss of a major company paid MPs, I think something like £2,500 per question to ask questions in the House of Commons, which became very, very controversial. And in the days when ministers and MPs would resign when there was a scandal, I do believe that there were some resignations as a result of that. Now, what I do want to say is all of the information which I'm providing here is publicly available. It's fully available on Companies House. It's available in the various newspapers. It's available in the published records of various court cases that have taken place. I'm not casting any aspersions on anything. I'm not saying that there is any improper behaviour. What I'm saying is there isn't enough transparency, and it looks like to the untrained eye that there might be either corruption or cronyism or some other element where perhaps the supplier has failed in their ability to deliver. So moving on from that, what we do have is an issue with PPE. And so let's say some of the PPE which has been delivered, Matt Hancock has said that there was never a shortage of PPE, which if you want to go through Twitter and you want to scroll through the news from the relevant time, is that there are NHS staffs that were wearing bin bags and they were using, welders' masks or whatever the equivalent is of that weren't to the necessary medical standard because there wasn't enough PPE available. If Matt Hancock wants to tell people that there wasn't enough PPE available, that is not the case. And there is oodles of evidence that backs up that statement. And so therefore, when you have companies that promise to provide PPE but aren't providing PPE, they're either providing face masks that don't meet the necessary standards, or as in the case of some other time sensitive equipment, they're actually pasting new expiry stickers over old and expired bits of equipment. So for example, they're putting expiry dates of October 2021 on pieces of equipment that actually ceased to be useful in October 2016, and then they're being provided to us in 2020. What we're looking at there is clear fraud, actually. Either the supplier isn't meeting the specification, or the supplier is falsely and knowingly misrepresenting the expiry dates of the products in order to get profit out of the public sector. And I think that's something that should be punishable by prosecution. I don't think that necessarily the government have the backbone to do that. So one of the other things I'm going to talk about is around National Audit Office. So the National Audit Office published a report which I'm going to link to, which is fairly damning. I'm just going to give you an idea of the page here. It's an investigation into government procurement during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a devastating and damning document that really highlights that there was incorrect specifications were used, insufficient justification was used for the direct award without competition, insufficient evidence was provided, insufficient documentation was provided. It all looks like a shambles. And the government haven't got a convincing argument to say that there weren't enough suppliers. My inbox was groaning with I was getting at least 9 or 10 emails a day from people I'd never heard of, offering to provide PPE, face masks, hand washing equipment, sanitizers, markings. Every day my inbox had 10 or so at least approaches from companies I'd never heard of, offering to provide me exactly what I needed. There was no shortage of people in the area who were both capable of providing and wanted to provide. And some of the major providers of things like face masks and PPE emailed the departments and they didn't get a response. Yet somehow Matt Hancock's pub landlord mate, who's run a company that provides Chinese takeaway boxes and plastic cups, gets a contract for 30 million for the provision of face masks in an area that they'd never done before. It looks suspicious, and yet somehow Matt Hancock is still saying in public, not only did he do nothing wrong, he's not going to apologise for providing the right amount of PPE. And when somebody said, why did you do this? And he's saying, are you saying that, a friend of a minister can't win government contracts? Well, the answer, Matt, very clearly is yes, a friend of a minister can win government contracts and can do so without necessary transparency, probity. There's no evidence around proof that the declaration of interest was followed, and there's no evidence to back up that the necessary due diligence and care took place during the award of the contracts. Now I'm going to talk through the steps which take place when you award a contract under the public sector. So in theory, even though Public Procurement Policy Notice 120, published on I think the 18th of March 2020, said that due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the government was able to do direct awards if it felt necessary and could justify it. What that doesn't mean is that you can throw all your previous due diligence approach and all your previous approaches around making sure that the supplier is suitable, qualified, has a track record, is the right size to deliver to the contract. What it means is you still have to go through those steps. You still have to check that a supplier is suitable to provide. Just because some guy texts you and go, I can provide you some PPE, mate, it doesn't mean that they should get the contract. You need to do certain amounts of checks to make sure that supplier is capable of providing it. Now, supplier selection criteria in public sector procurement is very clearly defined. There's a whole bunch of restrictions which you can remove people from bidding for the work under the restricted process, but those principles should also apply when you're not using the restricted process. It's the usual questions that you would ask. Has the company killed lots of people? Has the company been convicted of bribery? Has the company been convicted of, I think, some form of tax avoidance that's illegal? I can never remember the difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion. Has the company got a track record of delivering this type of service? Has the company been in existence for a number of years? What's the company's credit rating looking like? And what percentage of this company's turnover are we going to be if we're successful? So the criteria that we tend to have is that the company should be in existence for at least a minimum of 3 years and ideally longer, because normally contracts are 3 years or longer. And the only time that you can waive these requirements, by the way, is when you've got a very, very limited supply market. If you're buying astro telescopes, if you're buying battleships, for example, there are not 20 companies that make battleships. There's not dozens of companies that manufacture, astro telescopes and have them lying on the production line as if they were cars. These are the cases where you have to have some discretion. But in other cases, and PPE, face masks, NHS protective equipment, there are a number of suppliers in the market that are geared up and capable for providing this service. We should have been using those. And for example, if your company's just formed, so one of the companies which I've mentioned previously formed in July 2018, and in the middle of 2020, less than 2 years after the company had formed, had been awarded an enormous contract without any competition whatsoever. So the company should have been in existence for 3 years. And as a client, for example, the Department of Health or any company should be no more than about 40% of one firm's turnover. And the reason being that if you suddenly cancelled the contract, it might affect the long-term viability of that company. And there was a case in the 50s where a major American retailer was something like 95% of one of its suppliers' turnover. And what it was doing is actually it was just buying up extra stock and storing it, cut all the orders out. The company went under because it didn't have any turnover, and then they bought it from the administrators dirt cheap and effectively had bought their own manufacturer in order to reduce the profits that manufacturer was making by taking it in-house. And the government guidance is that you shouldn't be more than 40% of any one firm's turnover because it makes the firm too dependent upon you. And there could be I think accusations of abuse of market position by the public sector as a result. And then the third part around that is that they've got to have a track record of providing suitable similar work. So if you're in the business of manufacturing footballs, jewellery, takeaway boxes, you can't suddenly turn up to the Department of Health and go, yeah, we're experts at PPE, mate. You haven't got the track record to prove that. And this stuff is too important to take a chance on. And that's where, certainly, in my opinion, I think the procurements around this did fail. In so much as I don't think there was adequate due diligence that was paid. And if there was adequate due diligence around them, then, and I know this has happened on other public sector procurements, it could be that the guidance and advice that has been provided by the relevant legal teams or procurement teams may have been overruled by the minister. I know of a major public sector procurement, which happened a number of years ago, where the minister was advised by the head of procurement and the minister was advised by the legal services team that this could leave them open to challenge and it would breach the regulations. And the minister overruled that. I'm not going to name who that is because that information isn't publicly available, but I know it happened. I have the evidence. There's also a number of other things that we've got around this. So, for example, with the PPE, a number of contracts were drawn up after the company's already started the work. In one case, the company started the work on, I think, the 20th of March, and the contract was drawn up at around about the 3rd of May. So 6 weeks the company was operating. And these are not small contracts. These contracts are worth £500,000 at least, without a full and formal contract to define and control the expenditure that was taking place. And so therefore, if the supplier failed, there wasn't the contractual position there in order to be able to go, you failed as a supplier, and therefore there are remedies that need to take place. The other thing that happens is there is insufficient justification and there's insufficient documentation that the necessary due diligence has taken place. And if you want to read something boring, I do recommend the National Audit Office report on this. One of the other things I will say is actually the price of PPE, unsurprisingly, absolutely shot up. So if the NHS was paying the same price as it had been paying in 2019, it would have spent somewhere around a third of what the total expenditure of 18 billion actually was. And so there's what we're actually looking at is, for example, for some PPE, it was normally around about 33p per face mask in 2019 during the height of the COVID-19 panic. And bear in mind, these weren't openly tendered competitive prices. These were direct awards directly to a supplier without market competition. So the price went up from 33p on average for a face mask to in some cases £4.50. So that's 1,200%, 12 times more than it was before. And we also had body bags, for example. The average cost of a body bag in 2019 was £1 per body bag. For the mortuaries, it went up at the height of COVID-19 to £14.10. So suppliers were really gouging and taking advantage of and abusing their market position in the time of mass public crisis. And they were also exploiting the fact that competitive competition and tendering wasn't taking place. And so therefore effectively, the public sector spent much more money than it ever should have done because of a combination of factors. Obviously, no one could have predicted what was going to happen with COVID-19, but also due to what I regard to be a lack of appropriate due diligence and selecting not the best suppliers in the market is probably the nicest way of providing it. And that, alongside the fact that there was meant to be a VIP fast lane for some suppliers, means that effectively a lot of people got very rich out of COVID-19 and they didn't add any value to it. And there's a concept around that called disaster capitalism, where some firms actually want society to experience terrible things because they can get an awful lot of money out of it. And it's shameful that companies behave in that fashion. And it shouldn't rely on a crowd-funded defence that says that it's in the public interest to prevent this from happening. And so what we've got is the perception that there's no national outrage. And I want to be absolutely clear to you, from a purely professional point of view, awarding contracts to suppliers without multiple quotations during the case of a crisis is something that is ripe for exploitation by suppliers. And no supplier will tell you that they're making too much profit. Because otherwise the price of the body bags wouldn't have gone up 14 times the actual price it had been in 2019, and the price of face masks wouldn't have gone up 12 times than it was. I get that there was increased demand, but this wasn't good enough. There's a failure of the relevant people in the public sector to carry out adequate due diligence on the suppliers and make the right decisions. And it's shocking because, let's be blunt about it, every pound that is spent on something that doesn't work or is grossly over expensive is a pound that's taken out of the wallets of taxpayers. It's a pound that's taken out of council budgets. It's a pound that's taken out of social care budgets. It's a pound that's taken out of police budgets. If you think about all the other parts of the public sector, especially, for example, when Boris Johnson said he couldn't afford to spend an extra £5 million to Andy Burnham to make sure that the city of Greater Manchester had £80 million as part of its COVID defence fund. When he said he didn't have £5 million, what he really meant was, I don't have £5 million for you, the people of Manchester. I have £5 million for my mates. Because there was a lack of adequate transparency, and there was a lack of governance, and there was a lack of due diligence, which appears to be very obvious in the public sector in this. Now, how much of that was ministerial interference? How much of that was very stressed teams working very hard? How much of that was simple sloppiness and incompetence? I don't know. But all this information I'm giving you is publicly available. I'm drawing my own conclusions from that information, and that it's not pretty at all. So, for example, what we're looking at, if a company was awarded properly, even if a direct award without competition was the appropriate way of doing things, then it should have been to a company that had been in existence for at least 3 years. If you're going to award a 30 or a 50 million pound contract to a company, that firm's turnover should be at least 90 to 150 million pounds, and that company should specialise in the provision of health consumables such as PPE, face masks, gloves, gowns, that type of stuff. And some people just saw this as an opportunity to rip off the public sector and steal money out of the public purse. And as I said before, the £18.5 billion amounts to £610 per taxpayer in the UK. And I'm just going to wrap up here and go, that's what the scandal is about. Is that we are dealing with what was called a VIP fast lane. Now, the National Audit Office investigation revealed that of the companies that were successful, there were 151 companies that were awarded contracts as a result of COVID-19. Of those, 47 of those companies came out of the recommendations that were made to ministers, and there are 493 companies that approached ministers and people in senior positions directly and said, I can provide this service. So you stood a 1 in 10 chance if you approached a minister or a senior official and said, I would like to win some work, I can provide PPE. If you went through the open process. If you didn't approach a minister or you didn't have a recommendation from a senior member of staff, or maybe didn't have a recommendation from an MP, of those 14,982 companies that did not have a recommendation from an MP or the Secretary of Health or a minister, of those 14,982 companies, 104 were successful, which is a less than 1% chance. So if you had a recommendation or you had a line of introduction that came through somebody such as an MP, you stood 10 times more opportunity of winning the contract. And it's fundamentally unfair. And not only that, at the time when the public sector and our budgets are deeply, deeply distressed, where there's not enough money going around, and there are programs around how are we going to be able to afford the £400 billion cost of COVID, I guarantee you billions of pounds has been spent that didn't need to be spent on equipment that wasn't properly specified or wasn't made to the standards that it was meant to be made to, that was maybe rebadged as being in date when it was out of date, that wasn't fit for purpose. And fit for purpose is something that applies in the Sales of Good Act. So even on a consumer basis, if you buy something, there's a fitness for purpose application to it, which means it's got to be the purpose for which it's commonly understood. Now, if you're going to have a mug like this that says drink the music, the common understanding is you can't have a hole in the bottom, because what's the point of having a mug with a hole in it? It's not fit for purpose. You can't drink out of it. If you're going to be drinking out of, for example, a vessel, you shouldn't be using a thin plastic cup for the next 6 years. You would buy a durable, suitable item. This one, by the way, is available from Monorail. One of the finest record shops in the world, for I think £6.99, and it is designed by David Shrigley. But not only that, it's a well-made mug and it tastes lovely coming out of it. If I'd been using a plastic cup, let's say one of those free ones you get from a water dispenser, for the same amount of time as I've been using this, it would probably have disintegrated through use. So what we're looking at around fitness for purpose is it's got to be fit for the job for which it's commonly understood to be. In the same way that if you're going to put cladding on a high-rise building, it's got to be fireproof. It can't have a fire rating of B and be regarded as highly, highly flammable. And there are no plans in the changes to the current procurement regulations to prevent another Grenfell from happening, which is something that's a major, major concern to me. But I'm not going to get onto that because that's a completely different subject. When I started off, what I said is I think 19 out of the 20 people who voted for this said it's okay if I can do it, but try not to be boring. Hopefully I've tried not to be boring. I'm going to draw some very quick conclusions and then I'm going to come to an end. Effectively what we had during COVID-19 was a free-for-all. We had a piece of government advice, the policy note, that said that you could award contracts directly without competition due to emergency. But what that policy note doesn't do is it doesn't give people a free pass to give contracts to their mates that aren't suitable for the provision of the service. If you've got a turnover £145,000, you shouldn't be winning a contract for £30 million. You're not capable of moving to that size. You can't make your business suddenly about 200 times bigger to be able to cope with that extra bit of that extra demand. It's just not there, and you haven't got the track record to deliver it. So if you're going to be awarding contracts in the public sector, there's a number of things that need to happen around due diligence, which are that you need to do the adequate checks and governance to make sure that the company can provide what it says it's going to provide, and it's going to provide it to the standard that it's meant to provide it to. It's going to be in the right place at the right time for the right cost, and it's got to be the right bit of equipment, and often it's got to happen right now. The second one is around time. So the company has to be big enough. The company has to have a track record of delivering. You can't suddenly form a company and then get a contract for £45 million for PPE in the middle of a pandemic unless you're in Britain in 2020 and somehow you can get away with that. Now, the perception from the outside is that it looks very, very dodgy. It looks like it's cronyism. In fact, there's a word called kakistocracy, which means when we are governed by those that are least capable. And what we're looking at here is, you wouldn't make a decision to buy a car just if someone rang you up and went, I've got a car. You go, well, what does the car do? How fast does it go? What's the mileage per gallon? How old's the car? How many miles are on the car? Are you Bob a car salesman, or have you just stolen the car? These are the kind of, and what we need when we make decisions inside the public sector which need to fulfill Nolan's 7 principles of public life. And I need to come back to this. It's around openness, it's around integrity, it's around honesty, transparency, it's around being selfless. And it's around making decisions for the public good and not just for the good of your own wallets, wealth, assets, or the people that you know. And the current circumstances that we've got around some of the contract awards do not satisfy Nolan's 7 principles of public life. That's why there's a scandal around Matt Hancock, because to the outside observer, his mate, who was a pub landlord, sent him a text on WhatsApp. He got an invitation to provide a service. He won a contract for £30 million for the provision of PPE, even though he specialised in the provision of plastic takeaway boxes and cups, or a contract that was worth 200 times the size of his company. And there was no track record about previous successful delivery. There was no guarantee that the company would be there or be able to provide. There was no guarantees necessary that the company just, if you were going to pick somebody, it would be like picking me to be play for Manchester United. And anybody who knows me knows I'm absolutely terrible at football. I may not be as terrible at providing PPE as some of the companies that have provided it. And I certainly wouldn't dare think of putting stickers with new expiry dates over previously expired and out of date bits of equipment, because that's tantamount actually to manslaughter or murder. It's grossly misrepresenting the usefulness of your product. If someone said to me, "Well, here's a ready meal, or here's a bar of chocolate that went out in 2016. I've put a new sticker on saying it's fit for 2021. You'll be fine, mate." That's not good enough, and there should be consequences for bad contract decisions. Now, there's a Good Law project that are going through the courts at the moment, and the government's coming very, very heavily armed to try and argue that the fact that they spent 10.5 billion on directly awarded contracts to firms that in many cases may not have been suitable and had no track records and were just middlemen. Apparently the government's coming very, very harm to say that actually us knowing what they did with that 10.5 billion isn't in the public interest. I'm embarrassed by this government. In the old days, people would resign when they made mistakes. The press crucified Diane Abbott for drinking a gin and tonic on the tube, and yet Matt Hancock is responsible for the award of a £30 million contract to his local pub landlord for the provision of PPE, and it is actually scandalous. And we need to get back to the days where we can have trust in people inside government to make the right decisions and to do the right thing, and sometimes that means people have to resign. Because if it was in a private sector company and somebody went, "I've awarded 30 million quid to my mate, he's told me he's good," and you ended up finding out that the average cost that you were paying for body bags was 14 times what it used to be, and the average cost for face masks was 12 times what it used to be, I guarantee that HR would have been involved, and we need to hold people to the same standards. I don't want to say any more than that because there's going to be steam coming out of my ears, but this is why it matters. For every taxpayer in the UK, we have spent £610 on face masks and PPE, and over half of that has been awarded in single tenders, uncompetitive procurements where we were paying up to 14 times the previous price. And it's not good enough. The British public deserve better, and that is why there is a scandal about it. And although the government is clearly run by optics, the government is running in such a way that it hopes that it just looks good. And as long as it looks good, it doesn't matter how good it actually is. What matters is it looks good. This does not look good, guys. This looks really, really bad. And this looks like there is, at the very least, there is a case to answer around the decision-making process. I'm going to wrap up here. Don't forget this when it comes to voting in your local elections and your general elections. We need to hold politicians accountable for their decisions and their actions. They are paid to represent and to serve us. We do not serve them, and we need to hold them accountable. I'm going to end here. Usual rules apply. Don't be a dick in the comments. I will try and reference everything fully in either the description or the comments box. And my next episode will probably be about a pop group from about 35 years ago. In the meantime, stay safe, and I hope to see you all at the end of this pandemic in better, sunnier times. Thank you for spending 45 minutes with me whilst I talked with you about something. Hopefully, it wasn't too boring. Some of it is going to be quite dry, I'm afraid to say, but that's the nature. Sometimes bad things happen, and they are banal, and they are boring, and they hope to hide in the darkness. And the only thing we can really do is to drag those out and expose the truth and the facts. And hopefully that will change the world. Anyway, I'm going to stop being all Captain America about things, and I'll see you again some other time if you have an interest in movies, music, or old band t-shirts, because that's normally what I talk about. Anyway, see you soon, and thank you for your time. Bye.